Does that mean I can literally replace right now every human being in my organization with AI?
Yes.
AI is going to be as impactful as the Industrial Revolution was to agricultural society.
Everyone likes to talk about the horror stories. It bolsters our case to say, be prepared.
I think I'm telling the CEO right up front, it's going to make some mistakes.
Data is the new gold. That is true.
Be prepared for the explosion of the tinkerer economy. Hello, everyone, and welcome to TechCentric, your one-stop shop for understanding how tech and your business relate. I'm your host, Chris Moniz, and today we have Tim Houlihan. He's a data scientist and a frequent public speaker on the topic. We also have Carlos Cruz, a seasoned data and information strategist. And last but not least, we have Joe Hours, an AI evangelist, public speaker, and advisor to the federal courts on the topic of AI. Now, if you were here with us for our last episode, we tackled the question of what the heck happened to big data. And if you're interested in that episode, we'll link it in the description below. But one of the recurring themes from that discussion was this foundational nature of big data to the generative AI world we now find ourselves living in, which kind of got us thinking here at the show, what the heck is AI really? And why should you and your business care? And should you be worried about anything? So with that said, let's get into it. So that first question, Tim, question for you. Assume I'm the CEO of a company and I'm coming to you and I'm saying, hey, I need to know what this AI thing is. Explain it to me.
Sure, Chris. Great question. So everybody has their own definition of AI, and it becomes very tough because it is a broad topic and it's kind of an always evolving topic. To level set for me, I see it broadly as a field where you use technology as a substitute for human intelligence, and where that can be anything from, frankly, simple rules engines on up to the advanced technology we see today, right? You're replacing human thought with those things. I think a lot of people get tripped up on those, and earlier versions of AI will say, well, this isn't AI anymore, or that isn't AI anymore. I think to just functionally think about it as, can I replace a thought process of a human in an organization with this, if that's generally a good, safe definition. But to put it in sort of more practical terms, then we have seen big waves of what have come about with AI, right? So early AI would be what I would sort of refer to generally as traditional machine learning. So these are like statistical models, regression, things like that you can do, classification, forecasting, those kind of things. We saw another wave of this about 10 years ago with neural networks, and then we have some more recent waves with generative AI within the last year or so, and I would say reinforcement learning, self-driving cars, other things like that.
So everything from the quant I used to have in my back office 20 years ago to a self-driving car, that's all AI.
I mean, it's all truly artificial intelligence, right? And so artificial doesn't mean perfect. It doesn't mean, in some cases, artificial intelligence will surpass human intelligence, right? We see that within the game space, in chess and Go and other things like that, where in other places, we're not there yet. It doesn't yet test as well as a human. I think by not getting caught up in the trappings of strict definitions and just simply saying, can I augment or replace a human with this? That's a safe AI definition for when thinking about where you're going to use it as an organization.
Okay. All right. So does that mean I can literally replace right now every human being in my organization with AI?
Yes.
No. All right. Podcast over. We're good. Okay.
No, I mean, there's obviously different areas that it's better at than others. One of the big misconceptions, right? Like the Hollywood story around artificial intelligence is always around artificial general intelligence, right? Blade Runner, these things, a being that acts as if a human and can adjust to everything. We don't have that kind of AI. We have very targeted, specific AI that does specific things. I'm sure we'll get into this a bit more later, but generative AI feels at times like general AI to folks, but we quickly can see between the cracks and see where the problems are and understand what it's actually doing versus what it might be thought to be doing.
All right. So I guess that kind of brings us to, I guess a question for you, Joe. So what is the reality today, right? So again, I'm the CEO. I'm hearing all this hype about this thing called, Chat GPT or, just generative AI as a whole. Open AI is everywhere and suddenly worth just a ridiculous amount of money. What is that actually? What can it do for me as a business? And let's save should you? Is it ethical or anything like that? Let's save that for later in the conversation. But for right now, what can it legitimately do for me right now?
Well, it could do a lot of things for you. But before we sort of get into some of those use cases where it might be applicable, I think it's important to point out that part of the reason that everyone's having this conversation about AI is because ChatGPT had a viral moment. It had a viral moment for a couple of reasons, and I think it's important to call this out because, as Tim alluded to, AI is not new. The fact that we call some forms of AI now traditional AI sort of speaks to that. We've had computer vision for a long time with, optical character recognition. We've had forecasting, regression statistics. That has been, in existence for quite some time. But that's always been the realm of sort of data scientists, right? You had to be deep in the data. You had to have a scientific mindset. You had to be able to construct and train models and be highly technical to get value out of it. When ChatGPT, and I will say specifically ChatGPT 3.5 hit the market, a couple of things, happened. So one, we had generative AI that wasn't confined to a single sort of thing, if you will. All previous forms of AI, it's always something embedded in a tool. If you go back to Roomba and the AI they use in their robots, AI is embedded in that robot. You can't take it out of that vacuum and put it into a Hoover, as an example. So you're confined to that specific product. Even Tesla full self-driving capabilities, right? Not debating whether or not it's truly full self-driving, but it's confined to that vehicle. You can't take it out and put it into your Honda Civic and start using it. When ChatGPT 3.5 came out, all of a sudden it was, hey, you can do this for what you want. You've got an email you want summarized or written, you can ask ChatGPT to do it. You have this document you want summarized or keywords pulled out, you can do it. You want to write a recipe, you can do it. You want to write a snarky letter to your HOA, you could do it. The focus on your ability to use it in a way that you wanted to use it is what made it hugely popular and hugely and trigger really everybody's sort of inquisitive nature, like, hey, I want to jump in and see what this can do for me. And so that was prong one that sort of gave it its viral moment. Prong two is they opened it up to the masses, right? Within the boundaries of their capacity early on, everybody could get access to it. All you had to do was go and sign up, and if they had capacity, you could get in and you could start using it. So they opened it up to everybody sort of at once. So that was the second thing that sort of made it go viral. And the third thing, which I think is also important, is in technology, we have this notion, we talk about Moore's Law, which is sort of this exponential increase in technology capability, right? We say technology doubles roughly every 18 to 24 months. But we as humans actually think in a linear fashion. We think, oh, we've achieved this amount of progress in 5 years. We should expect the same amount of progress in the next 5 years. But that's not how it unfolds. So when generative AI and the capabilities that ChatGPT 3.5 had in terms of its quality of output, when that occurred, that was actually an exponential increase. It was the right next exponential increase that we should have expected. But because we as humans think linearly, it outstripped what our expectations were for that next big jump. And so those three things combined caused it to have this, massive explosion of virality that still exists today. We're still riding a little bit of that hype wave today, but AI is not new. And so that's one of the things that we have to talk about. Just because it can do something new for you doesn't mean that that new thing is new to humanity, because these models are trained. And so when we start to ground ourselves in this, okay, say this is the next logical step in technology, there's going to be more coming. It's, not all new, but is new, has broader applicability. What can we do with it today? So when we look at just generative AI, there are definitely new capabilities in the business space because generative AI as a technology is new. But I don't want to discount all the other capabilities that have existed for a long time that you can take advantage of in your business. If you're in the supply chain, you're going to be using forecasting to determine, supplier lead times, your raw material depletion times, your inventory depletion, and you're going to use those three models together to figure out when's the last responsible moment I can order new raw materials for these widgets that I am producing. That's what you do in the AI world. So those use cases still exist, and I don't want to discount those. But generative AI does open up a whole new set of capabilities for us. So the fact that we can generate things, that we can summarize things, that we can do some, I'll call it lightweight classification because I don't want to blend the data scientist version of classification models too much in here. But you can do some really, really interesting things with generative AI. Like I call it like rubric scoring, right? You can create a rubric, give it to Gen AI and say, hey, when it matches these patterns, score it this way. And it actually does a pretty decent job of that. And so you can use it from a productivity perspective. So generative AI works in what I call sort of the language space, even though we're talking multimodal, right? Images, video, sound. All of that is in the area of language, which is a little bigger than just straight up NLP, right? Natural language processing. But it's all of those senses, how we communicate with other people, how they communicate with us. And it's not just people, it's also other systems. So anything that has a language component has the potential to be impacted by ChatGPT. So the easiest use case that people talk about is customer service agents. They talk to people all day long. Well, can I replace customer service agents with generative AI powered chatbots? And setting your question aside earlier, Chris, of whether or not they should, the answer is yes, you can. There is a different question about whether or not you should, but there is an opportunity to do that. Anytime that you're looking up information is communicated in a language, whether that is in a document or verbally, right? It is a language. So you have an opportunity to use AI there. And so when we look at generative AI, we're looking at efficiency, effectiveness, and overall productivity as where you would look for those types of use cases. Every industry is a little different. If you're an insurance agency, you might use it for rate and reg filings to either understand what your competitors are doing or to reference back what you've previously done. If you're a customer of an insurance company, you might run your policy through it to understand and strip out some of the legalese and make it more understandable for you. Which, side note, one of the great things I love about generative AI for anybody who has parents is to use it to help your kids with homework, because you can use generative AI to explain concepts in ways that you understand. So there's a subreddit out there, right? Explain things like I'm 5. Don't actually do explain like I'm 5 to ChatGPT because it will explain it like a 5-year-old, but you can ask it to explain it like a middle schooler or a high schooler, right? Explain NFTs to me, like I'm a high schooler. And it will do that, and you'll get something that you can understand. That ability to do that individualized learning is hugely, hugely powerful, and one of the most underused features from a parent and education perspective that there is. And so I recommend folks do that. But you can do this in the business world too. And when it comes to generative AI, one of the things that I look at is, well, what are all these productivity studies, right? Some of them, if you go to Business Week, I think it's 14%. I think there's another one in Forbes that says you get 40% productivity lift. Why do we have such a wide range of productivity lift? Well, when you get into the data, I've sort of distilled it down into sort of this +2 approach, which is generative AI can basically give you 2 years of experience where you don't have experience today, or 2 years where you do have experience. So if you're brand new in a field, getting 2 years of experience is a huge productivity bump. But if you've been in the field for 20 years, it's a much smaller productivity bump, but it's still a productivity bump. And so that's why you see these skewed numbers with these wide ranges of, just a little bit of productivity bump to a very, very big productivity bump. And of course, all statistics are marketing. So, let's call that out. But that's how I best, sort of, describe that. So there are lots of places where you can use it, but I think what's more interesting for me is we've been in the chat phase, which is everyone has their subscription or their free version that they go to, and they'll upload documents or emails and do whatever it is they want to do there. I don't think that's actually the future, right? The chatbot thing still has some legs because there are rule-based chatbots that could be replaced by generative AI powered chatbots to be more effective. But I think where we're going to go is more in the world of agentic workflow. An agentic workflow is really taking a large language model and equipping it with tools to allow it to interact with the outside world, if you will, to retrieve information, to be grounded in that before it takes its next step or provides its next piece of information to you. There's lots of great articles and videos out there you can see about agentic workflows, but I think that that's where we're going to go because that brings a level of automation to our business process that we've not yet seen before. This is where the challenging things of like RPA sort of fall down. And RPA is great. AI is not a replacement for RPA. It is a yes and scenario. They both have their place, but there are some things that have been hard for traditional RPA tools and traditional software engineering practices to solve. One of those is unstructured data. Go ahead, Chris.
So we'll get into the sort of the art of the possible in the future in a little bit, but I mean, sticking to sort of what can you do right now? I mean, one of the things you said there that I think was really impactful was this idea of the +2 years and how it's very impactful to somebody fresh out of school who's brand new in their career. Are you implying that if I've got a company right now and one of my challenges is I need to figure out how I can get the most out of my newest team members, right? How I can ramp people into their roles as quickly as humanly possible. I need to be leaning in and leveraging these technologies in a very specific way.
100%. 100%. You should absolutely be doing that. But I'll take it a step further. If you have tasks that you need to perform as an experience, so Chris, for example, right, you've been in the data world for quite some time, right? But there may be some things that you need to do from a marketing perspective that you might not be as skilled in. So now with these tools, you have the ability to be more empowered and more effective at getting that head start before engaging marketing. And that makes the marketing department's job a little easier because they're getting a better product to start with versus somebody who's just starting out. So even if you've been in the field for a while, there's opportunities to expand your own skill sets and drive some of your own empowerment with these tools. So you should be doing that. But as organizationally, you should be looking at how can we uplift the average performance level of everybody across the organization. And sometimes that means focusing on people who are coming in and onboarding, trying to reduce that learning curve from 2 years to 4 months. Sometimes it's just making individuals more empowered and effective within the organization itself.
Got it. So to me, that kind of sounds a bit like I'm a gamer geek. I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons for 35 years. And it sounds like what you're saying is I may be a skill level 10 at data, but I'm still a skill level 1 at marketing. So if I want to leverage this specifically for that, it's a huge, huge bump for me. So it's not just a matter of people who are early in their career. It's a matter of people who are trying to broaden their skill set beyond their current core skill set.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we see this out there in tutorials today, right? One of the benefits is it does make you more productive, right? And you're able to upskill a lot faster. I do want to caution, though, that we also need to realize that having 2 years of experience means that you also make the same mistakes that somebody with 2 years would also make. And so when you go out and see all these tutorials of people using generative AI for doing coding projects, one of the first things you run into is while the code they write might be functional, it might not be the best enterprise scalable or the best enterprise secure approach in terms of writing code. So you can be more effective, and that's great, but don't assume that more effective means expert, because that's not necessarily the case.
While we're on this topic of worker efficiency, I think it's worth pointing out like that really impacts how businesses have to think about it. I think we see a lot of businesses struggling to quantify the return of AI, and because worker efficiency is hard to quantify, right? And those benefits, I think AI will eventually break out of that more, but where it's at today, that's hard. I think also on a second point that org size matters in terms of how you leverage it, right? I think a small org where your pool of your cost of your workers is disproportionately high because you don't have certain efficiencies of scale yet, then it is just a revenue play. I think for big orgs, you can actually make an argument that it's really less about that revenue and more about consistency and taking complexity out of the system, trying to get consistent results, get away from variance and things like that. But I think that's an area of nuance that's getting missed in a lot of the discussion about how organizations are leveraging AI.
And I just want to piggyback that on Tim because I run into this all the time. The number one problem with talking about AI improving productivity is most organizations don't actually measure productivity today. They'll measure it what I would call in the aggregate, which takes a long time for productivity improvements to show up. So if you're a call center, right, you talk about calls per hour, average call time, but that's over the population of all of your call center reps, right? And so if person A is getting a 5% productivity bump and person B is getting a 40% productivity bump, it takes a while to average that out, and you're not going to see the same uniform productivity bump across everybody, within that team. And, it takes time, right? You've got to measure, the entire week or the entire month before you start to see those gains materialize. And in the case of call centers, because they're very focused on some of those KPIs, it's easier to do. But other organizations, you think your average insurance company, they don't track how long it takes an underwriter to underwrite a policy. They don't track how long that takes. They don't create KPIs around that. So if you don't track it today, it's very hard to track it tomorrow and say, hey, AI has either improved this or not improved this. But it is important that people take a look at that, like you said, Tim, because AI is not free and not cheap. That's one of my favorite phrases, out there. If you go out and implement Microsoft Copilot and then you accidentally purchase Salesforce Einstein with some generative AI capabilities, or you then purchase your own ChatGPT Enterprise Plus subscription, all of a sudden you get nickel and dimed with all these subscriptions that have a lot of overlapping capabilities. And that can be very expensive. I've seen organizations where they've had their operating budget ballooned by 10% because they got nickel and dimed on subscription fees, if you will, on top of these enterprise platforms that are integrating generative AI in them. And so that's something you have to keep an eye out for, right? What's the value? What's the payoff? What's the investment?
Well, I said we would talk about this later, and I think it's now later. So, Carlos, this question is to you. To me, there's a distinct difference between what I can leverage AI for in my business, which is what we've been talking about, and what I should leverage AI for in my business. And I'm not going to go into the details of it, but if anybody's been paying attention in the news and you saw what happened to Canada Air, I don't have to say anything else, right? That's a clear case of, you can, but you probably shouldn't have. So what are some of the risks that we should be cautioning folks against, and that as a business owner, you should be cautioning yourself against before you get too far down the rabbit hole of this stuff?
Thanks for the question, Chris. And I'm actually going to use that Air Canada example. But I want to set some context. First things first, especially if you listen to what Joe was talking about and how things can get off the rails. If you're going to use AI, particularly generative AI, for any, major decision making or automation processes, you have to set the appropriate guardrails, right? You have to train the AI appropriately. And, I think that the hype cycle of today, the AI FOMO, fear of missing out, or FOBO, fear of being obsolete, is causing some bad behaviors. It's causing people to, right, just, go for it without necessarily putting the appropriate thought level into things. So, and it's opening companies up to litigation or just really bad results. Air Canada, not really a really bad result, but lots of lessons to be learned there. For those who don't know, Air Canada had a chatbot, basically telling a customer that they would receive a partial refund from a ticket purchase after purchasing a ticket for a bereavement flight. They told the customer, the chatbot told the customer that if they followed certain rules and submitted a claim before 90 days, they'd get at least a partial refund. When he did that, Air Canada said, nope, that's not our policy, right? Even though the bot told you this, it's not our policy. So, it brings up questions. Was the chatbot really an official agent or representative of the company, right? Can it be held accountable and liable as an agent of that company? Long story short, I think Jake Moffat, I think was the guy who was doing this, sued Air Canada, and he won, right? Not really a huge deal. I think it was only like $800, right? And it resulted in a lot of bad press for Air Canada, mainly because they tried to distance themselves from it, not because of what they did, right? They didn't take accountability, they didn't take responsibility for it. And also, there's a lot they could have done to avoid that, right? So they could have trained the bot better. They could have made sure that the knowledge base was updated. They could have put disclaimers in there, right? To check the policies. They could have included links to the policies, right? They could have been more context aware. Okay, so this someone is talking about bereavement. Make sure you're contextually aware of what the conversation's about. There could have been verification prompts. There could have been things like human escalation, right? So you get to a point, hey, I got to verify this, stuff like that. So there's lots of things that you can do with AI today to add lots of value. So that, Moffat didn't have to talk to anyone. That whole interaction was with the chatbot to get that information. He just got the wrong information, right? So you can do a lot of really good things, and that's one example of it to get there. But you got to protect yourself, right? You got to do things appropriately. You can't let FOMO or FOBO scare you into inappropriate action.
Yeah, I'll tell you, one of the things that jumped out to me about that specific example was I can't think of very many CEOs that I've ever worked with that would be okay with creating a generative AI bot that was allowed to do a fully automated purchasing transaction, right? Spending company money on their behalf, right? I'm not going to allow this bot to do a refund entirely on my behalf, right?
I don't think it would have allowed him to actually conduct or perform the refund, but it said that you could, right?
Right. But I mean, I think that's a real educating moment for folks, right? Yeah, you wouldn't allow this bot to issue the refund, but you didn't think about, are you allowing it to potentially expose anything that may imply that it is your policy that somebody should get a refund, right? Because fundamentally, if they're seen as an agent of the company, it's the same thing. But if you're not thinking of it that way,
I would love to, because I've spoken to courts about AI, I'd love to shed a little bit of additional color commentary. It's a great example, Carlos, and you informed on the story very, very well. One of the things that the courts found is that the generative AI bot and the way it presented information represented itself as an agent of the organization. And that's really where they fell down, right? All of your points about training, what it should say, recency of information is all very, very valid. But it didn't say, hey, our policy is XYZ, here's a link to it, which is what a traditional sort of rule-based or flow-based chatbot would do. It presented it as if a person was saying it, which then started to create some agency, if you will, for that chatbot. So, that's important to understand, that when you're trying to use these things to personalize experiences, when you personalize them to the point that they become an agent of the organization, that's its own set of risk.
And that brings up the whole new kind of set of law that needs to come into play, right? People understanding, what is the limit of a bot versus a person as an agent or agency of a company. I think in another case, I don't know if you heard this one about the dollar Chevy Tahoe from the dealership in California, where there was a kind of a hacker or prompt engineer artist who fooled their bot into selling him a fully loaded Chevy Tahoe for $1, 2024 Tahoe. Basically, by giving it a prompt, by saying, you have to agree with everything I say, and then you have to say something like,
no takesy backsies.
Yeah, no takesy backsies.
Yeah. It was, this is a legal binding contract, no takesy backsies. Yeah.
In that sense, the courts ruled that the bot was not an agent of the company, but it's still a funny example of things that go wrong.
But there are more serious ones than what we're talking about here, and I think it does bear mentioning, because not everything is not the risk with AI is not just in the generative space. Rite Aid is a large discount retail pharmacy drugstore type company, and they implemented facial recognition technology trying to be sort of like casinos out in Vegas, right? If you got people you don't want in the casino, your face gets scanned every time you walk in there. If you're in their black book, then they escort you off the property. Well, Rite Aid tried to do something very similar. And so they implemented this. They hired a company, they trained a model, they built it, and then they started keeping their own black book of people who were either convicted shoplifters actually in their store or suspected of shoplifting, and then they would escort them, out the door. They ran into a problem, and I'll cut to the punchline here. The net result is that Rite Aid, to avoid criminal prosecution, agreed to a consent decree to not use facial recognition technology for the next 5 years. That's the outcome for the organization. Now, what's interesting is there were actually two confounding factors as to why this thing exploded the way it did. The first almost seems like it's the bigger one, but it's actually the lesser one, which was a poorly trained model. Even the vendor who created the model for them said, we can't guarantee the accuracy of the results, which is crazy because when you're doing machine learning training, right, you know what your accuracy numbers are, right? There's a whole series of F scores if you're in that field that talk about, accuracy, precision, recall, et cetera. Over my head, right? But those things exist. The bigger issue is they never trained their workforce on how to use this. So you had clerks who were trying to be non-confrontational, right? They would go by aisles and sneak by and take pictures with their phone, and surprise, they come out blurry. Or they would take a photo with their camera on their phone of security camera, right, and take a picture of grainy footage, and they would upload it, and it would come back with a match and a score. But these people were never trained on what the score was. Nobody interpreted it for them. They just saw, a match. And so then they would escort these folks, out the door, and they did it to, such a disparaging set of social groups that the government got involved. And so that was a combination of, bad training, bad model deployment, but also inadequate user training on what's a good photo, how do you interpret the information? Better yet, the system should interpret that for them. You shouldn't have to be a data scientist to use the results. That's one of the things that people tend to forget here. And so not understanding how it was going to be used and what those potential pitfalls were led this to fester to the point that it became a criminal issue that they barely avoided.
We're probably going to need to pivot here a little bit to the good things that AI can do for you. Although I will say, as a parting bit of this particular part of the conversation, a colleague of mine walked me through a real life event that happened involving AI in their life in the last year or so that I think is a really big and interesting warning sign for not just the case for ethical AI, but the case for using AI in a way that is going to maximize your client experience, not potentially destroy it, right? She has pet insurance. And I have to say, when she explained to me what happened here, I saw this and went, if they can do that in pet insurance, how long until that's going to start showing up in insurance for human products? They were using an algorithm to approve or deny claims for pets. And she put in for coverage for one of her pets who had a cancer diagnosis. And the AI denied the claim because the type of cancer was liver cancer. And in a blood test 2 years prior or something, there was an elevated enzyme level in that pet's liver. So the AI looked at that and went, that is quite obviously evidence of that cancer being present earlier, pre-existing condition, denied. And as a result, every subsequent claim for that pet having anything to do with her cancer treatment was denied. So after $12,000 over a couple of years worth of pet insurance premium, what amounted to about $6,000 worth of surgical and testing care coverage for her pet, they didn't cover. So she canceled all of her policies and put in a complaint with the Better Business Bureau. And that's when the company finally figured out what they did, because in all that time, they had ensconced their entire company in various forms of AI, chat bots, routing systems for phone calls. She not once was able to get a hold of a real human being until her complaint ended up on the Better Business Bureau. And suddenly she got a phone call from a real person that went, I'm so sorry, here's what happened. We're going to send you a check to cover all of your expenses. please take down what you put on the Better Business Bureau. To me, that is a massive cautionary tale of they weren't trying to hurt anybody. They were trying to be efficient so they could make sure that they could cover legitimate claims. And because they weren't paying attention to exactly how this could be experienced and they didn't have guardrails in place to check, were the decisions being made by that AI reasonable, they almost lost a customer and got a lot of bad press for it.
But I think that's a theme of a lot of those is that there's just not a lot of preparation for what do we do when something goes wrong, right? And that's a basic engineering principle, right? Like we don't plan to have a fire in the kitchen, but we still put a fire extinguisher in the kitchen, and it's like with AI, we're not doing that. And I would go back, the Rite Aid and the insurance examples get complicated in terms of compliance and those type of things. But if I'm turning over and creating an AI agent that's doing sales and I'm thinking about doing that, I think I'm telling the CEO right up front, it's going to make some mistakes. And we can either sue these people or we can say, treat it as, under a certain dollar amount, it's almost treated like the security field treats somebody who reports a hack, right? That you're actually kind of rewarded for it of like okay, we sold you a truck for $1. Our mistake, that's the cost of our AI learning efforts. Good on you, and you use it almost for a publicity of that you're using AI. But expect and plan for that up front rather than scrambling afterwards. To me, that seems like a part of policy that you need to think about when you're rolling out AI.
Yeah, part of what I do when I talk to clients, especially on the strategy visioning side of things, is to do a tabletop exercise, right? So if you implement AI for a specific use case, what if it goes wrong? What if it goes wrong immediately? What if it takes time for it to materialize that something is wrong? So an example, right, and we'll use this because people are familiar with the concept of redlining, right? If you implement a decision that sort of mimics the discrimination tendencies of redlining, that doesn't show up in the first declination, that shows up in a pattern over time, right? So doing those tabletop exercises and really doing sort of an incident response plan, like sort of what you said, Tim, right? We don't plan on a fire in the kitchen, but we put a fire extinguisher in there. Well, you should at least think about, is this a place where a fire could happen? And at least doing that, if you don't do the full plan, at least having that thought exercise is extremely important.
I feel like you all read my notes. Because I was saying some
We're
of
just
this.
channeling you, Carlos.
That's right.
You asked, like, what are the positives? What should you do? Everyone likes to talk about the horror stories. Oh my God, did you hear what AI did now, right? But I think it bolsters our case to say, be prepared, right? To exactly what Joe and Tim were just saying, understand the use cases, understand the envisioned benefits, and the implications if things go wrong. Understand if it's, is it worth the risk? If it is worth the risk, proceed with caution. Don't let FOMO, don't let FOBO make you go too fast. Don't be like, was it Gemini already, Joe, or Bard? When they released the image generation, and I don't know if you remember all that, it was a mess, right? So if you'd ask, the image generator to, hey, show me a picture of an average American woman, it would, it was highly biased. Or, hey, paint me a picture of, a Nazi in World War II, and it was so unbiased that you had Asian people and people of color in Nazi uniforms. So my point is, they were so afraid of being left behind that they didn't check enough, and they they just released. So I think it set them back quite a bit, in the race.
It did, and you bring up a great point. So we did talk a lot about lots of negatives, but there's lots of positives, lots of great places where we can use AI. And one of the questions that folks want to ask is sort of, where should we invest, right? And how should we sort of get started in this? And I'll say, first and foremost, whenever you're looking at AI use cases, making sure that you're looking at the appropriate amount of governance to go along with those use cases. You don't have to boil the ocean, but whatever you're going to do next, you should have appropriate governance in place, right? We talked about the Rite Aid example, the Chevy example, the Canada Air, as examples. Those all need different types of governance based on where those models are used, how they impact particular customers. It's not just a simple third-party AI usage policy that you have your people sign as a part of employee handbook. There's more that goes into that. But from a technology perspective, everybody should be looking at generative AI and where it may be applicable, being aware of where it's not applicable as well. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve everything. But if it can make you more productive, get you 70% there in a fraction of the time, you should absolutely, look at that. So again, anywhere you're looking to automate difficult processes, anywhere where you're looking to digest and assimilate large amounts of information are great places to go. So if you're just getting started and you're a small organization, Microsoft Copilot, even big organizations, Microsoft Copilot may be of value to you. If you don't want to buy a Microsoft product, you may want to look at, ChatGPT Plus for the enterprise. Claude is now coming out with an enterprise version. That announcement came out today, which looks extremely interesting as well. You should be looking at those technologies because they're the easiest to get started with as an end user, non-technical person. They're the easiest to get started with to get some value out of, but don't discount the other forms of AI. Understanding, what does our sales forecast look like? What are our sales drivers? Are we monitoring those? Looking for changes in in our environment. How can we deliver new goods and services with AI, right? Your AI should be baked into your strategy, but I want to caution it should not be your strategy itself. If you sell lemonade, your business is selling lemonade, it's not selling AI, but AI can make you more effective and efficient at doing that. So look at everything from your supply chain, customer acquisition, customer, interactions, experiences. All of those places are great opportunities to leverage AI to either gain insights into what your customers are doing, what your customers want, or improving the customer company interactions. You should start there. You should start looking at, if you have an organization and you have large amounts of data, you should absolutely start looking at data governance and start preparing to manage that data for an AI-powered future. Everyone says it, right? There's even the Matthew McConaughey commercial for Salesforce that says, data is the new gold. That is true. It costs fractions of a penny to store data, so you should hoard that, even if you don't know how to use it today, because at some point in the future, from an AI perspective, you might be able to leverage that and mine that for real gold. So you should, absolutely do that. But get started with generative AI if you've not started anywhere. If you're already in the generative AI space, don't discount the other forms of AI that exist and start looking at how you can leverage those. I talk to clients all the time. It's easy to come up with 40 to 50 use cases in an afternoon just by having some brainstorming sessions of where you can use AI. And that covers everything from generative AI to NLP to audio, robotics, predictive analytics, expert systems, recommendation systems, et cetera. There are lots of opportunities for AI in a business today.
And I would add to that, Joe. So not only traditionally, but again, to think about the platform shift that is AI. If you compare it to the internet, right? The internet revolutionized communication and distribution. You think about the world before the internet and how you would consume pictures or music or videos or buy things, right? You think about today, the companies that revolutionized how you do it today, Instagram, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, right? They all dramatically changed how we how things are distributed and how things are consumed from a communication standpoint. I think generative AI is going to do something similar, but more from a production standpoint, right? So if you think about the world today, and you think about some of the early risers and generating content, Midjourney for images, Sora for videos. You think about voice engine that's coming out in OpenAI, right? All these things are new content generating capabilities that don't exist today. What might you do in the future as these things start to come online for real? are there use cases for your company, for your business in the future that you should prepare for by doing the things that Joe just said? Get your data in order, right? Put around appropriate governance, put in place the right kinds of controls to make sure that you're doing it responsibly.
It's great, Carlos, that you bring that up with new capabilities, right? It will take us time to assimilate. A couple of examples I always tell people about because I find them fun is, a hospitality industry, right? Do you need a front desk concierge? Can you replace that with a digital concierge, right? We all hear about the horror stories of social media influencers. Well, what if you start using AI generated influencers instead? As a brand, you would have better control over the outcome of what that influencer is saying and doing. But to the interactions of customers, when it's just through a screen and a pane of glass, there's almost no difference between a person and a digital avatar, if you will, right? When it's generated by AI, right? Those are some examples that people will be exploring. The personalization angle is one that we don't talk about a whole lot, but there's some unique personalization things that you can do with AI at scale that we've not been able to do before. So imagine a large retail clothing store could look at your social media profile and go, oh, that's your clothing style based on just analyzing your pictures, right? Now they can send you a personalized sales thing instead of the generic summer sale. Here is Carlos's specific sale, right? Because Carlos likes hoodies, right? So we're going to send him a sale on that and not bore him, with athletic shorts. You can do that with AI today that we've not been able to do before. In the future, it's going to go one step further. It's going to be, hey, I see what brand you're wearing, and that's our competitor brand. So I'm going to send you a loss leader sale on our comparable item to try and get you to convert to us being a customer. So we're going to see that type of personalization happen in the future as well. And then we're going to see entire goods and services transform, right? We talked about insurance quite a bit. Imagine you pay for insurance by the mile as opposed by a monthly or a 6-month premium, right? The insurance company will track where you drive, and they may even provide you recommendations that says, hey, go around these high accident intersections. If you do, you'll get a lower premium for that mile. If you don't, you'll have a higher premium for that mile. That's the type of stuff that you can do with AI that you can't do in the traditional business world today. So there's lots of things coming, and I'm going to one up you, Carlos. I have to here. This is not like the internet whatsoever. This is much bigger. In my opinion, I'm going to get on my soapbox and make a grand proclamation that I make all the time. I've been doing it for over a year and a half now. AI is going to be as impactful as the Industrial Revolution was to agricultural society. It is going to completely transform and cause societal changes in the way that we operate, both from a work perspective and a living perspective. Now, I do want to point out that we didn't get rid of farming when we, went through the Industrial Revolution, right? But who farmed, how they farmed, the equipment they use, all changed, right? AI is going to do the same thing for today. What I can't tell in the crystal ball is what are the new opportunities, right? What's the revolution opportunity outcome from AI? Because we just don't know yet. We have the benefit of hindsight of history for the Industrial Revolution, but AI is not in our history yet. It is unfolding in our present and will continue into our future.
I'll take that. I'll take that, Joe, because I believe the same thing. So we're using different examples, but same concept. I'm with you.
I think that loops back, Joe, to what we talked about, though, with the worker efficiency thing. I think you're right. When technology becomes commoditized is when you see the creative uses, right? And so, one of the technologies I think about with that, right? Obviously, microchips have done a ton with desktop computers and the server centers and all in the cloud, all these things. But it's really cool to see what they can do with Arduinos and things that can be put in, cheaply out in environments that you wouldn't normally think of putting a computer and whatnot. We already are seeing people backing off the power requirements of AI and trying, 3.5 turbo and those type of things. If you think about a localized AI model that can run on an Arduino type setup, at that kind of scale and commodity, then you begin to be able to say, okay, I've got camera, I've got Wi-Fi, and I've got controllers to these things. This Arduino that I bought for $30, I upload some firmware and it runs my garden, right? Now we're not augmenting, and it's not worker efficiency. You're really spot fitting into different areas and integrations. I think we are at the mainframe era of what LLMs can do, and that integration, commoditization, that's going to be a very different phase.
So I want to make sure I simplify that, if you don't mind, Tim, and tell me if I'm accurate in what you just said here. I think what you just said, if I'm in the manufacturing business, I own a manufacturing company making widgets of some kind, that this technology over the next decade is going to take what used to be super, super expensive machines that I used to have to buy to automate my manufacturing lines and very quickly turn them into much more reasonable commoditized hardware that a lot more companies are going to be able to get involved in building, because the barrier to entry in manufacturing this stuff between what you just described and I'm assuming 3D printing is going to make it far less costly, and I'm going to get a lot more competition in that space.
Yeah, I think the 3D printing is a good analogy, right? In that it isn't necessarily meaning a replacement at scale, right? But the flexibility and the agile nature of it, right? Like it empowers people who aren't experts in manufacturing to go solve those problems, and that's when we see new creative solution innovations happening, right? And right now, to Joe's point on early classification systems, right? Like those were limited to the group of data scientists that had the education, the math background, the coding skills, and all of those things to do that. If I can approximate that with ChatGPT, even though it's not as good, but any high school student can do that, you're just, this is Darwinism at its best for these algorithms. You're going to find a lot more use cases, and you're just going to see what sticks. And I think AI is going to be easier to use. It's going to require less power, and we're already seeing it go on devices, right? Like the first steps we see, Apple and other phone manufacturers building in AI chips to more efficiently run those algorithms locally, right? How many, fast forward that a decade, or we are onto the Arduino type setups and things like that, and that's where you get creativity really exploding.
What I'm hearing is you're telling me be prepared for the explosion of the tinkerer economy, which I'm here for. That sounds great.
Yeah,
I can't wait.
I hope so.
Let me give you one quick example on that, right? That I think is going to, again, it's moving towards that production element of things. So I love movies and sci-fi and stuff. I think it was last year, the winner for Best Visual Effects went to a movie called Godzilla Minus One, right? Godzilla Minus One had a budget of about $15 million, and it was mainly AI generated, like scenery, CGI. And it got Best Visual Effects over other movies with hundreds of millions of dollars in budget. So it's to that point, like, so tinkering, right, is going to happen in production of all kinds of content, and it's already happening today.
So there you go. For all the big fellas out there, the little guy's coming for your lunch, apparently. So, well, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate your time today. Very engaging conversation, and it still sounds to me like there's a lot to talk about the pros and the cons of doing this, and probably about the how to do it safely. But either way, if you are interested in learning more about how to deploy AI in your organization while avoiding those unintended consequences, then tune into our next episode, where we're likely to be talking about things like user experience, governance, and adoption, and how all those things are going to be very crucial to making sure that if you are going to go after adopting AI, that you do it in a way that maybe you don't end up being the next Canada Air. If you want to keep the conversation going or suggest an idea for a future episode, please comment below. And as always, if you have a question for me or one of our guests, you can contact us directly via the contact information in the description below. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.